Hey everyone, it's Daria. Welcome back to my channel full of lit, and today I'm going to be telling you all about the books that I read in the months of June and July. The first two books I read were White Rage and White Fragility, and I read these books for the Blackout Buddy Read, which was hosted by Shay over at Books with Shay. I'll link her channel in the description below. White Rage by Carol Anderson was a nonfiction piece of work that basically chronicles the ways in which white America has retaliated anytime there's any kind of political or social advancement for Black Americans. The title of the novel just sums it up so well. It's about the ways in which white people emotionally and physically cannot handle the advancement of Black people in this country. She covers the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the KKK, the Civil Rights Movement, redlining, the Tulsa Massacre, Brown versus the Board of Education. Some of what Carol Anderson covers in this book is taught in high school classrooms, at least in the ones that I have been in, but never with the framing and the lens that she provides in this novel. A professor of mine explained the way in which race is taught in this country very aptly. As children in school, we are taught that slavery happened and that was bad, so we had a war and we ended it. And then Jim Crow happened and Martin Luther King gave a speech and led a march, and then that was solved. And now racism went away because we had our first Black president, and now everything's fine. And as American students, we are taught that same tired narrative over and over again in elementary school, in middle school, in high school. Maybe they'll flesh it out with some more details, but that is essentially the basic narrative that we are taught throughout our entire education. And Carol Anderson just does such a great job explaining why that narrative is so false and so harmful. Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility is a book written by a white person for white people specifically. But I would even venture to say that it's a book that a lot of non-Black people of color can also stand to read and learn something from. For many readers who have been engaging in conversations about white fragility, white tears, structural racism, etc., everything that DiAngelo brings up in this novel is not necessarily going to be anything new to you. But I would say that this is a good starting point for white readers, and even, like I mentioned, for some non-Black POC as well. Next, I read Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, and I discovered a newfound favorite novel. This book follows a Chinese-American family in the late 80s when they discover that their eldest daughter and the girl who is the pride of their family has been found dead in a lake. The book is not too concerned with solving the mystery of what happened to Lydia. Instead, it is very invested in the lives of every member of this family. We get to hear from the perspective of the mother, father, older brother, younger sister, and Lydia herself. We went back in time and got to see James, a young Chinese professor, and Marilyn, a young white woman, fall in love for the first time and deal with the ramifications of their relationship. We get to see the absolutely captivating dynamics between the three siblings. We have Nath, the eldest brother, who feels like he is living in the shadow of Lydia's success. Lydia is the prized child. She is the child that the parents pour their heart and soul and money and attention into. And Nath ends up resenting his sister because of this. And we feel his pain at the same time that we understand, because of Lydia's perspective, that she doesn't want this kind of pressure or attention, and she would love nothing more than to be Nate's friend and Nate's confidant. And then we have Hannah, who lives on the margins of this family. She's so often neglected that she just accepts this as her position in the family, the forgotten child. This book honestly scared me with how accurate and realistic it could be with its depictions of family dynamics and the dysfunction that can go on within them through no fault of anyone in particular. You can understand perfectly why every member of this family is doing the things that they do, and yet you also realize how their actions have really sometimes horrible consequences for the other members of the family. I cannot wait to reread this book. I feel like I am going to discover so many things that I didn't see the first time around, and there is nothing more incredible than that in a story. The next book I read was All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. I didn't give this a rating because I've sort of decided for myself that I don't feel comfortable assigning a numerical rating to a person's life experiences, so I'm just not going to do that any longer. When I try to describe this book, the only thing that I can say is that it is a glorious punch to the gut.
Hey guys, it's Editing Daria here. So since recording this video, I have become aware that the author of this novel, George M. Johnson, has recently come out as non-binary and their pronouns are they, them. So out of respect for the author, I will be dubbing over every time I use the improper pronouns for the rest of this video. Okay, let's get back to the wrap up.
Johnson includes a lot of very triggering and very harsh topics in the novel. In this book, the author talks about the crushing weight of heterosexuality and gender-centric expectations and how it influenced the way that they interacted with people in their life and the way that they presented themselves and stifled their own identity for so long. This book is about joy, loss, isolation, community, love. It's a narrative that's not really ever going to leave you after you've read it, and I genuinely believe that it has the power to change your worldview. Next, I read Kingston Calendar's middle grade novel, King and the Dragonflies. Kingston is a young boy who is fully convinced that his older brother who has died is now a dragonfly, and he's constantly searching in the bayou for the dragonfly that is his brother. Kingston has a best friend named Sandy, and there's a lot of rumors in the town that he lives in that Sandy might be gay. At the same time, King is starting to question his own sexuality and who he is as a person. And everything kind of comes to a head when Sandy goes missing. This book is a really fascinating depiction of the intersectionality of blackness and queerness. This book is also a novel about friendships and what it means to have a best friend, what it means to be a friend to another person. And sometimes best friendship means that you're the source of your best friend's greatest pain, but at the same time, you're the only person who can truly understand them and lift them up and love them for who they are. Next, I read Min Jin Lee's historical fiction novel, Pachinko. This book follows multiple generations of a Korean family that moves to Japan to live there in the midst of the Japanese colonial occupation of Korea. This book follows 3 different generations of a family, and every family member's perspective and story is so distinct and unique. And yet there is still similarities and unity in their stories because they are Koreans living in Japan and are highly discriminated against. This book will hurt. It will hurt to read, not only because of its length and the heaviness of the topics and the really dense prose, but because you become so invested in these people and their lives that every single struggle, every hardship feels personal. We see the struggle of these people as they are constantly belittled for being Korean, as they struggle to find gainful employment, as they are constantly underestimated and underappreciated by those around them. If you want a book that, for lack of a better description, is going to rip your heart out, Pachinko is the book for you. Next, I read You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnston, and this book had me smiling from ear to ear the whole time I was reading it. This book follows a high school senior named Liz, who has never really fit in at her school, but this doesn't bother Liz too much because she has always had her eye on the end goal of leaving behind this town and attending Pennington College where she wants to perform in their orchestra. Liz has her audition for the college's orchestra and she doesn't get in. And she was counting on getting into the orchestra's program so that they could provide her financial aid, otherwise she can't afford to go to the college. But then she gets an idea. She decides that she's going to run for her high school's prom king and queen because the winner gets a full scholarship. So now Liz is determined to win the crown, but at the same time there is a new girl at the school who is also running for prom queen, who Liz may or may not, but definitely does have feelings for. This book will make you happy. Unless you have a heart of absolute concrete, this book is guaranteed to make you happy. Liz is smart, she's determined, she's witty, and it was so sweet getting to watch her develop feelings for and pursue a relationship with this girl Mac. Now, all that being said, this book is not without its more poignant moments. It has a really great portrayal of female friendships and what it means when you feel like your friend does not support you and in fact actively tries to sabotage you. It shines a light on class privilege and white privilege. This book is just, it's so good. I loved it. Next, I read Trevor Noah's memoir, Born a Crime, and there is no other way for a person to consume the story besides the audiobook. For anyone who has watched Trevor Noah's stand-up, who watches The Daily Show, you know that this man is a masterful storyteller. The inflections of his voice, the emphasis he puts on certain parts of the story, the way that he slows down certain parts of his narrative to build tension, all of it creates this unique and incredible audio listening experience that you can't get if you're just reading this book on the page. In this book, Trevor shares anecdotes and experiences of his life growing up in apartheid South Africa. He was born to a black mother and a white Swiss German father, and just like the title suggests, the union between his mother and father was illegal, and he should not have existed according to the laws of South Africa at that time. Throughout his story, Trevor also does a really great way of weaving in the politics and laws and general social climate of his home country at the time where he was growing up. And it works so well because obviously everything that was going on in his life personally was affected by what was going on in the country as a whole. What really stood out to me in this novel was just how much pride and love and respect Trevor Noah has for his mother. In interviews leading up to the release of this book, Trevor kept saying that after I wrote down my life story, I realized that my mother was the hero, not me. And he's kind of right. Next, I read Temporary Wife Temptation by J.C. Lee. This book follows Garrett Song, who is the eldest son of the Song family, and he's going to be inheriting the family business. He's incredibly dedicated to his work, and he kind of gets thrown for a loop when his grandma tells him that she has picked out a bride for him to marry. Garrett, in the heat and anxiety of the moment, says that he's actually already engaged. Our other main character, Natalie Sobel, actually works for Garrett in the same building, and she was trying to get a promotion so that she can gain custody of her niece, whose parents recently passed away. Unfortunately, Natalie didn't get the promotion, which means that it's highly unlikely that she'll be able to get custody of her niece. Garrett then offers Natalie a deal. If she marries him and pretends to be his wife, then he will try to get her that promotion, and she'll look like a more viable candidate for custody because she has such a rich and well-to-do husband. I love a good marriage for convenience plot, and this book was super fun and super sexy. I have to say though that I could never get fully invested in Garrett and Natalie as individual characters, and towards the end of the novel, it was starting to drag a bit. I particularly enjoyed that this was a romance between two Korean people and didn't have a white person in sight. That is something we need more from romances. People of color falling in love with other people of color. I want to see more of it. Next, I read R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War, and this book took me so damn long to finish. And it's not because the book was bad. In fact, it was incredible. I just was really struggling because this is one of the first epic fantasy, high fantasy, adult fantasy, however you want to categorize it, books that I've read in a while. I believe the only other high fantasy novel that I have read was A Game of Thrones. This book follows a young peasant girl named Rin who decides that she is going to try to take the Keju, which is a test that, if passed, will allow a person access to Senegard, which is a elite and cutthroat military school in the capital of the empire. Now, Rin passes the test and gets into the school, but that is really only the start of the story. She faces intense discrimination and violence from her classmates who believe that she is not worthy of being at this school. Rin is also learning about the history and attempting to master shamanism, and while all of this is going on, there is war brewing and coming to the empire. The world that Kuang created is one of the most brutal that I have ever encountered. This is a book about war, and I know you probably think that that is self-explanatory given the title. It is about not just fighting the battles, but strategy, rationing food, civilian casualties. We're not following the empire leaders or captains of the army. We are on this journey with everyday soldiers who are in the midst of the battle fighting for their lives. We are also told in excruciating detail the trauma that is inflicted on the citizens of the empire. I know that R.F. Kuang was actually directly inspired by the Nanking Massacre, which if you don't know about, I highly recommend that you check out Iris Chang's nonfiction book on the subject. Also, every character in this novel has a heartbeat. They have desire, they have flaws, and none of them can be deemed a bad guy or a good guy because that doesn't exist in the real world and it doesn't exist in the middle of a war. You have to become allies with someone you once considered your mortal enemy. Next, I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde for the first time, and I cannot believe it took me this long to read it, but I have to thank Heather from Aphrodite Reads, who I will link in the description below. She's the one who finally kicked my butt into gear and got me to finally read this incredible book. For those of you who have never heard about this book and don't know anything about its plot, even though I doubt there are very many of you, this novel follows a young, very beautiful man named Dorian Gray who sells his soul so that he can remain immortal and beautiful for the rest of his life. What really intrigued me about this novel was not so much the plot or the characters, but instead how those two things served this larger debate of aestheticism versus morality. Oscar Wilde has this preface where he says that all art is useless, and if you try to find meaning in art, if you try to find some kind of moral message in art, then you've missed the point of it completely. Art is just meant to be beautiful, and that's its only purpose. This is the pinnacle of an aesthetic philosophy, and that philosophy is something which the character Lord Henry exemplifies. He doesn't care about being a good person. His only goal in life is to enjoy things, enjoy beautiful things, do whatever he wants wants, whenever he wants, with no care as to how it might affect others. And he passes on this aesthetic philosophy to Dorian, who then takes it to the absolute extreme and wants to live an aesthetic, hedonistic life for as long as possible, that he literally sells his soul, his potential to goodness, his humanity, so that he can remain beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. Despite the fact that I have used the word aesthetic so many times in this video while describing this novel is not actually advocating for aestheticism in my eyes. Did I even aestheticism? See, this is when my lisp really comes around and screws me. Because what happens in the end of this novel? Spoilers, I'm gonna tell you what happens in the end of this novel. Dorian kills himself, and we realize that a life based purely on pleasure and beauty and aesthetics is a life lived without meaning, without the brilliance of all the things that humanity has to offer. Pain and suffering, goodness, human connection. Dorian missed out on all of it, and for what? So he could look like a pretty little blonde boy for the rest of his life? It's a really shitty deal in my opinion. Next up, I read Menace by J.M. Darhower, and I read this on the recommendation of Mina over at Mina Reads. I will link her channel in the description below. This book follows Lorenzo, who is a cutthroat mafia boss, and one day he gets all of his money stolen by a girl and then becomes determined to find her. One thing that kind of surprised me about this novel is that even though the guy I described, Lorenzo, sounds like your typical alpha male romance hero, he actually kind of wasn't. The main heroine, Morgan, was a sex worker, and she didn't feel ashamed about that, and she didn't want Lorenzo's pity or help to get out of that job. This book had consent, sex positivity, and Lorenzo never belittled Morgan or didn't think of her as her own independent, autonomous person, which made the sex scenes really, really good. Even though I really liked what the story was doing and I liked how different it was from the typical misogynistic, slut-shamey, alpha male romances that I've read, I just couldn't fully immerse myself in the story and didn't fall completely head over heels for Lorenzo or Morgan or their relationship. I think the book was also just a tad bit too long. I really wish that the pacing hadn't dragged so much during the novel. So even though I enjoyed this book, I don't really see myself rushing out anytime soon to pick up the sequel. Next, I read Sabaa Tahir's An Ember in the Ashes, and I actually read this book as part of Penguin Teen's Ember read-along. I will link my vlog for that book in the description below. And then I loved that book so much that I ran out and immediately read A Torch Against the Night. Sabaa Tahir is so incredible at plotting and pacing her novels. And to top it all off, she has some incredible character work. At no point in either of these two books did I feel like her pacing faltered. Every scene had a purpose. I never felt like I was reading a filler scene and waiting for them to get to the action. Every scene had meaning, and every character was contributing to the greater plot. And that is something that is so rare to find, not only in fantasy, but in any genre. When it comes to trilogies or series in general, people tend to talk about a second book slump. And let me just say that Sabaa Tahir has no idea what that is. A Torch Against the Night took everything I loved about Ember and elevated it. I'm sitting here and I'm filming this video when all I really want to be doing is reading A Reaper at the Gates. But I also don't want to read it because I know how long I'm going to have to wait for the final book. Not as long as true OG Ember fans have had to wait, but a long time still. Next, I read James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk, and this is actually the first piece of fiction that I've read by Baldwin, and I loved it. This book follows a young black woman named Tish who just finds out that she's pregnant around the same time that her boyfriend, a black man named Fawny, has been incarcerated due to a false accusation of rape. This book is a love story. We get to follow Tish and Fawny's relationship from the very start where they first meet, to those first inclinations of attraction, and then finally to these really poignant and heartwarming moments of intimacy between the two of them. And yet we have this narrative of a young black man's life being potentially ruined and stripped away from him because of a false accusation of rape. Family is a key component in this novel. Not only the family that is starting between Tish and Fawny, but Tish and Fawny's respective families as well, and the ways in which they react to their relationship and what occurs with Fawny. For example, Fawny's mother and his sisters do not like Tish and do not think she is worthy of being in a relationship with their brother and son. Tish has an older sister who loves her so fiercely that she is literally willing to kill people for her sister. Tish's father is incredibly supportive of Tish and Fonnie and their future baby, and he doesn't look down on Tish for getting pregnant and really wants to support the both of them in their future. This is a love story, but it is also a story of how injustice, incarceration, and anti-blackness can severely hurt and harm entire families in their futures. Next, I read One to Watch by Kate Stayman London, and this book just gave me that shot of serotonin that I really needed. This novel follows Bea Schumacher, who is a plus-size influencer and blogger, and one day she writes a blog post about how this reality show that is pretty much The Bachelor without being called The Bachelor is severely lacking in racial and body representation. The post goes absolutely viral, and then before she knows it, Bea is being called up by the producers of this show, Main Squeeze, and they offer her the chance to be the lead of the next show. Bea agrees to be the main squeeze, and then we watch her on her journey as she is romanced by multiple men. The structure of this novel is impeccable. The writer obviously has a very good understanding of the Bachelor franchise and the way that people who follow the show interact on social media. A lot of times we'll get little snippets of, let's say, a podcast of fans of the show who were talking about last night's episode, or a bunch of Instagram comments of people who think that Bea shouldn't be the main squeeze, and People articles about on-set gossip and revelations. They were so fun to read and showed that the author had a really great understanding of what she was doing, and she knows how to tell the story well. Also, the chapters are not titled as chapters. They're broken down based on episodes and how many men are left. So for example, it's episode 1 with 25 men, then episode 2, 18 men, etc., until we get to the final episode with 2 men left. Besides the structure of this novel, the other thing that the author did so well is that she made the reader think that it was equally plausible for Bea to choose any of these guys. At one point, we get down to like 4 or 5 guys who are really in the running to be the winner, and I loved all of them pretty much equally, and I could also see how each of them could be potentially not the best match for Bea at the same time. We had one character who was super sweet and kind and just seemed like the perfect guy, but he was also really, really young and had never been in a serious relationship. We had another guy who was incredibly handsome and really flirty with Bea from the start, but at the same time we were wondering, is it too good to be true? Is he just faking this for endorsements and fame? And of course, throughout the novel, we see the ways that the producers and the people on the show will treat Bea really, really poorly because of her weight and her appearance. And some of those moments were really, really hard to read about because they rang so true for me. Finally, let me say that when you get to the last guy, when Bea makes her final pick, it really feels like she chose the right guy for her. The last thing I'm going to be talking about in this wrap-up, and the last thing that I read in the month of July, was a bit of an outlier for me. It was a manga called Blood on the Tracks by Shuzo Oshimi. I first heard about this manga when I watched a video from the channel Super Eye Patch Wolf, which I will link in the description below. This book follows a young 14-year-old boy named Seichi Osabe, who has a mother who loves him very much. And at first, you don't think much of it. You think that she's a bit overbearing, a bit overprotective. And then, at the very end of this first volume, she does something so disturbing, violent, and out of the blue that your entire perception of her and her relationship with her son changes. This first volume of the manga is really an introduction, a setup establishing the characters and who they are and their relationships with one another. It's really in the future volumes where the truly unsettling and disturbing happenings start to occur. The thing that makes this story so compelling and so terrifying is the art and the way that this manga artist and author has such a distinct understanding of human emotion. His artwork and his story are very character driven. A lot of times he will fill an entire page with just this very close-up shot of a character's face. And these close-ups will make your skin crawl. They will make you want to look away from the page. This manga takes a mother's love for her son, something that should be so pure, and distorts it and makes it into something ugly. The video that I linked by Super Eye Patch Wolf does have spoilers in it, so I would recommend that you don't watch it if you want to go into the series blind. I watched it and I still was as horrified as I think I would have been if I didn't know anything about this story. So there you have it, you guys, all the books that I read in the months of June and July. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. Let me know if you read any of these books and what your thoughts were on them, or just let me know what you read in the past 2 months. As always, you can find my social media links in the description below, so check those out if you would like, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!